One may not believe in miracles, but if one considers an incredible, almost impossible coincidence of circumstances a miracle, then they do happen. Baya Bakari, who was scheduled to die on June 30, 2009, along with 152 other passengers on Yemenia Flight 626, knows this better than most. We tell the story of the girl who was the sole survivor of one of the most scandalous plane crashes of the 2000s. In June 2009, two airliners manufactured by Airbus crashed at once. By an evil irony of fate, the first crash happened on the first day of that month, and the second on the last. Both catastrophes are still the biggest for their airlines, and both are linked to France, although they happened many thousands of kilometers apart. On June 1st, an Air France A330 flying from Rio de Janeiro to Paris disappeared from radar over the Atlantic Ocean. An investigation revealed that the plane fell into the water due to possible malfunctions and crew errors. All 216 people on board were killed. The crash remains the largest in the history of Air France. On June 30, 2009, a Yemenia Airbus A310 airliner flying Flight 626 from Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, to Moroni, the capital of the Comoros, crashed into the Indian Ocean on approach. There were 153 people on board, including 66 French nationals. The crash also remains the biggest for Yemenia Airlines. Its causes seem to have been officially established, but much remains unclear. Around midnight on June 30, a Yemenia airliner with flight number 70ADJ was approaching Moroni. The pilots requested permission to land at Prince Said Ibrahim International Airport. Harbor controllers opened a corridor for the Yemeni Airbus. A couple of minutes later, it disappeared from the radar. The investigation quickly turned into an international scandal. Representatives of Yemenia accused the French Commission of trying to damage the business reputation of the company and all of Yemen. Investigators announced that the pilots and employees of Yemenia were to blame, and that the plane should not have been flown at all because of its poor technical condition. Nevertheless, full data from the flight recorders could not be obtained. They were damaged by corrosion. The Yemeni side claimed that the plane crashed because of strong wind gusts, uncharacteristic for this region. Indeed, a cold anticyclone raged in the region in late June 2009, which can be called anomalous for the Comoros. Moreover, representatives of the Yemeni authorities suspected that the plane had been shot down. However, investigators have not been able to find any facts pointing to malicious intent. Another dubious theory suggested that the pilots had crashed the plane deliberately. But all this showdown, still going on to this day, would begin later. 9 hours after the crash, the incredible news spread around the world: a survivor had been found at the crash site. As dawn broke, rescuers found 12-year-old Baya Bakari at sea, clinging to the wreckage of the dead plane's fuselage. On June 29, 2009, Aziza Bakari and her daughter flew from Paris to the Comoros for Grandpa Baya's wedding. The girl's parents were born on the islands but, like 200,000 compatriots, moved to France, whose colony the Comoros remained until 1974. The holiday was approaching. The choice was whether to fly on the 26th or the 29th. She chose the 29th. And she survived. Baya's father, Qasim Bakari, told Europe 1 Radio the day after the disaster. The connection was made in the capital of Yemen. The 5-hour flight from Paris to Sana'a was well remembered by the girl, though not in the most pleasant way. The plane was small, there were flies circling in the cabin, and it smelled like a toilet. But the flight itself was fine, she recalled in 2022. The Airbus A310 that mother and daughter Bakari boarded in Yemen was much more comfortable. Unfortunately, it didn't keep its passengers safe. The plane first flew in 1990, was owned by a leasing company until 1999 and was leased to small airlines in France, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and the US. Then it was bought out by Yemenia. Bakari has no recollection of what happened next. She says that the last thing she felt before she lost consciousness was something like an electric shock running through her body. What followed was darkness. The data obtained by the French investigators indicate that the plane hit the water at high speed. In such cases, there is little chance of survival for the people on board, but Bakari was not the only survivor of the crash. Bakari later recounted that when she regained consciousness in the water, her first thought was that she had fallen out of the plane because her forehead was pressed too hard against the porthole, and when she was rescued, her mother would scold her for not wearing her seatbelt properly. It was the thought of her mother, who was the closest person to Bakari, that helped her get through the whole 9 hours. She still hoped for a reunion that wasn't destined to happen. Later, some amateur journalists wrote that the young Frenchwoman spent almost 24 hours in the water, but she clearly counted how much time she fought for life in the kerosene stain left on the surface of the water from the dead airliner. No matter how many people survived the crash, only Bakari could be found 9 hours later. Bakari was taken to Moroni Hospital in moderate condition. As the doctors said, the girl could not get warm for several hours. However, her consciousness was clear and she was communicating with the nursing staff. This miraculous rescue, however, was not without dubious conspiracy theories. As Bakari recounted in her 2010 autobiographical book Moi Bahia, La Miraculi, some researchers did not believe she could have survived such a disaster, and even theorized that Bakari had actually fallen off a boat of some illegal immigrants. To the rest of the world, she was a true heroine. The girl returned to France on a government plane, accompanied by Alain Juand, the country's foreign minister. Her father and other family members met her at Paris Le Bourget Airport. Bakari spent another 3 weeks in a French hospital with broken pelvic bones, broken collarbone, burned knees, and quite a bit of damage to her face. However, considering what she had been through, these injuries could be considered minor. French President Nicolas Sarkozy visited her in the hospital. Only a couple of weeks later, the psychologist who worked with her did tell the girl that no one else, including her mother, had survived the crash. The hardest part was coming to terms with my mother's death. I was very close to her, Bakari said in May 2022 at the Flight 626 crash hearing. Even 13 years later, she can't hold back tears when talking about Aziz. After releasing a book in 2010, the girl practically stopped talking to the media. She concentrated on her studies and getting back to normal life. The same year, however, 2010 saw the arrival of a man whose call would be considered no less of a miracle by thousands of authors around the world than Bakari's salvation. The story of the loss of Flight 626 is not over. Relatives of the victims are still trying to get Yemenia to admit guilt and at least some kind of compensation. An international expert commission named the company's pilots to blame, but the air carrier refuses to admit this. Representatives of the company refused to attend the trial, citing the fact that Yemen has been in a civil war for 8 years. In addition, they said, the current leadership has nothing to do with the people who ran Yemenia in 2009. It's just a shame. Even if the current management wasn't at the helm then, it's still their company. And I and all these families want to be heard, Bakari said, speaking to reporters after the meeting. However, it is unlikely that the court will have any effect on the behavior of the Yemeni carrier. The country now has 2 de facto governments, and it lives in a state of foreign intervention, so there is no international legal framework to speak of. Nevertheless, Baya Bakari is very eager to get at the truth. After all these years, she feels guilty about the victims.